The most powerful woman in Europe walked into the Oval Office carrying the accumulated weight of 7 decades of stability. And when she walked out, she carried something else entirely, something colder, heavier, and far more final than any policy document or diplomatic agreement. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed, perfect. Now enjoy the video. It did not look dramatic from the outside. There were no emergency broadcasts, no raised voices captured by cameras, no visible rupture in the choreography of global leadership. But inside that room, something fundamental had shifted. Not broken in a loud, explosive way, but quietly dismantled with precision. Because Donald Trump did not declare war on Europe, and he did not threaten it in the traditional sense. He simply removed the protection it had relied on for generations, and in doing so, exposed a vulnerability that had always existed beneath the surface. When said the words, "I will not pay," she believed she was defending a principle, drawing a line that could not be crossed without unravelling the political legitimacy of the European Union itself. What she did not realise in that moment was that those 3 words were not the start of a negotiation, but the final confirmation of a decision that had already been made long before she arrived in Washington. The invitation that brought her there had never followed the usual diplomatic script. There were no coordinated announcements between Brussels and the White House, no carefully managed press expectations, no symbolic gestures designed to reassure markets and allies alike. Instead, the request came quietly, almost abruptly, through channels that bypass the normal ceremonial layers of international diplomacy. Officials within the immediately sensed that something was different. Some described the tone as unusually direct, others as intentionally stripped of politeness, but those closest to the situation understood the deeper implication. This was not a meeting between partners. It was a confrontation framed in the language of diplomacy, but structured like a reckoning. Von der Leyen's team responded with the only strategy they believed could work: preparation. For 6 weeks, and her advisors assembled one of the most comprehensive briefing packages in recent European history, drawing on economic data, defence spending analyses, trade dependencies, and legal frameworks tied to obligations. They built arguments that were meant to be unbreakable, tested scenarios in simulated negotiations, and refined responses until every potential question had a structured answer. By the time her plane landed at Joint Base Andrews, she was armed with facts, projections, and a clear understanding of Europe's position. What she did not account for was the possibility that facts would not matter, that projections would not be debated, and that the structure she relied on would not even be acknowledged. The motorcade that carried her into Washington moved through a city that seemed outwardly unchanged, and yet the atmosphere felt unusually heavy, as though something significant had already begun behind closed doors. Inside the vehicle, she reviewed her notes one final time, mentally rehearsing the opening lines that would set the tone for what she still believed was a negotiation between allies. The Oval Office told a different story before a single word was spoken. The arrangement of the rooms subtly broke protocol, positioning the American side in a way that conveyed control while compressing the European delegation into a less dominant space. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible to an outside observer, but to those trained in the language of power, it was unmistakable. Stood without moving forward, his posture rigid, his expression devoid of the usual diplomatic warmth. The silence that followed her entrance was not accidental, and it was deliberate. Extended just long enough to disrupt the rhythm of expectation and force an imbalance before the conversation even began. When she extended her hand, it was an instinctive gesture rooted in decades of diplomatic practice. When he refused to take it, the message was immediate and unmistakable. This was not a meeting of equals. This was something else entirely. His first words confirmed it. There was no formal greeting, no acknowledgement of her position, only a direct statement that stripped away all pretense. She knew why she was there. Before her team could respond, a folder was placed on the desk and slid toward her with a casual motion that contrasted sharply with the weight of what it contained. The document inside was not structured like a proposal. It was not framed as a starting point for negotiation, and nor did it leave room for adjustment. It was presented as a final accounting, meticulously detailed and supported by decades of historical data. At its centre was a number, $2.3 trillion, representing what the United States calculated as the cumulative cost of providing security and stability to Europe since the end of the Second World War. It included everything from to ongoing military expenditures tied to NATO commitments. It reframed the entire transatlantic relationship not as a partnership, but as a long-standing imbalance. Her response came quickly, firmly, and without hesitation. She rejected the premise outright. Europe could not and would not accept the idea of retroactive financial obligation for a system built on mutual interest and shared values. Hey, the words "I will not pay" were delivered with the full authority of her office, and in any other context they might have marked the beginning of a prolonged and complex negotiation. Instead, they marked the exact moment the dynamic shifted irreversibly. Trump's reaction was not anger, but satisfaction. His calm demeanour, coupled with a measured smile, signalled that the outcome he anticipated had just been confirmed. What followed was not an escalation in the traditional sense, but a systematic unveiling of a strategy that had already been designed, approved and set into motion. He described it not as retaliation, but as a sequence of actions that would redefine the relationship between the United States and Europe at every level: economic, financial and military. The first phase targeted the economic foundation of key European states. Tariffs were not introduced as broad measures, but as highly specific tools calibrated to exploit the vulnerabilities of individual industries. German automotive exports faced immediate and overwhelming barriers, threatening the stability of one of Europe's most critical economic sectors. French industries tied to pharmaceuticals and luxury goods encountered similar pressures, while Italian manufacturing faced disruptions that would ripple through supply chains across the continent. Each measure was designed not only to weaken economic output, but to create internal political pressure within individual member states, making coordinated European responses increasingly difficult. The second phase shifted from visible economic measures to the less visible, but far more consequential realm of financial systems. Or access to dollar-based liquidity, a cornerstone of global financial stability, was quietly reclassified under new regulatory scrutiny. This move did not generate immediate headlines, but its implications were profound. European financial institutions, heavily integrated into a system anchored by American currency and policy, faced a gradual tightening of conditions that would increase borrowing costs and strain public finances. Programs that defined European social policy, healthcare, pensions, public sector funding would come under pressure as financial stability eroded incrementally rather than collapsing all at once. The final phase addressed security, and it was here that the full scale of the shift became clear. The United States signalled its intention to withdraw its military presence from Europe within a defined time frame, effectively removing the security framework that had underpinned European stability for decades. This was not presented as a threat, but as a policy decision framed in terms of national interest and strategic realignment. The implications extended far beyond military logistics, altering the balance of power and forcing European leaders to confront a reality in which they would need to assume full responsibility for their own defence in a far more uncertain geopolitical environment. By the time the meeting ended, the structure that had defined transatlantic relations since the mid-20th century had been fundamentally challenged. And there was no formal conclusion, no joint statement, and no immediate public acknowledgement of what had transpired. Yet the effects began to emerge quickly. Analysts from institutions such as and began to describe the situation as a turning point, while academic voices, including those from highlighted the systemic risks associated with such a rapid and comprehensive shift. Markets responded with volatility, political leaders faced increasing pressure, and the cohesion of the European Union was tested in ways that had not been seen in decades. What had begun as a single meeting evolved into a broader crisis that touched every aspect of governance, from economic policy to defence strategy. The absence of immediate clarity only amplified the uncertainty, creating an environment in which speculation often moved faster than verified information. And at the centre of it all remained a single moment. I'm defined by three words that seemed simple at the time but carried consequences far beyond their immediate context. The question now is not whether that moment mattered, but how far its impact will extend. Can Europe adapt quickly enough to a reality in which long-standing assumptions no longer hold? Will internal divisions deepen under external pressure, or will they force a new level of unity? And perhaps most importantly, was this the final stage of a transformation that had been building for years, or only the beginning of something even more profound? Because if this was not an isolated decision but part of a larger strategic shift, then what comes next may not be announced in advance. It may not arrive with warnings or headlines. It may unfold quietly, piece by piece, until the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment comes, the question will not be how it's